There's a moment that used to really unravel me. Not anger, not criticism, and not even conflict. Just a slight shift. The pause, the change in tone, the subtle disappointment that felt heavier than the words themselves. And before I could think logically, my body was already in motion, explaining, softening, rewinding, or rewording. And for years, I thought I was just really accommodating. But what I now know and really deeply understand, both as a clinician and someone who lived this for so many years, is that this was not about sensitivity. Rather, it was about survival alignment strategy, which formed in childhood. When connection once felt precarious, the system learned to prioritize relational safety above internal ownership of experience. Today, we're going deep. Why disappointing others can feel destabilizing for women with complex trauma. How our nervous systems carry this pattern, and how we can begin to expand our capacity beyond survival alignment into regulated choice. Welcome to Reclaiming Me, a trauma-informed podcast helping women with complex PTSD heal the lasting impact of childhood attachment wounds from parents and caregivers, so you can finally release people-pleasing and perfectionism and learn to trust in relationships, beginning with the one you have with yourself. I'm your host, Cindy Payne, therapist, trauma specialist, and a woman who has walked this path both personally and professionally. Welcome back, everybody. I'm so glad that you joined me this week to talk about overcoming the fear of disappointing others. And today's episode is going to have some main takeaways that I really encourage you to listen for. And number one is that the fear of disappointing others often comes from early relational patterns. It's adaptive learning, not necessarily an oversensitivity, as we may have been told. Number two, appeasement, which includes fawning, developed as a protective alignment strategy and can be consciously reshaped. And finally, healing shows up as increased capacity. And what increased capacity can look like is tolerating more discomfort, expanding your choices, and responding with intentionality. So as we head into part one of today's episode, we're going to be focusing again on attachment and the nervous system encoding. So if you haven't listened to the previous episodes 72 through 78 on the different attachment styles, you might want to go back and listen to those because it's going to probably make a little bit more sense to you whenever we get into that portion. But back to part one, attachment and nervous system encoding. So when someone registers disappointment in your presence, your body might begin responding before your mind does. And this isn't something that we're always naturally aware of in the beginning. And when our body responds before our mind does, it's not a flaw. Actually, it's a really smart response. It's patterned neurobiology. Just to give you a little bit of background on patterned neurobiology, Judith Herman, psychiatrist, explains that trauma fundamentally alters relational safety, not just in our memories, but in our bodily anticipation. And when you go back and you listen to those attachment episodes, you'll remember we talked about Mary Ainsworth. She was an attachment researcher, and she showed how children calibrate their behavior to preserve connection with their attachment figure. Often, this minimizes their own internal experience in favor of relational harmony. So if they're distressed internally, but they need to maintain closeness with the attachment figure, they're not going to show that necessarily on the outside with their body language, but it doesn't mean that they are not experiencing something pretty dramatic internally. And for women who grew up with inconsistent attunement, emotional unpredictability, maybe high levels of criticism or conditional regard, disappointment wasn't experienced on a mild level. Disappointment, rather, was survival information. Because disappointment could mean anything from withdrawal to disapproval or maybe just flat out instability. So sometimes your system reacts as though danger is present long before the actual situation contains threat. And I want to point out why this context is so important, because it tells us the fear of disappointing is not about being dramatic or caring too much. In fact, it has very little to do with that at all. It is, again, nervous system encoding. And the good news is that coding can be updated. So let's dive a little bit deeper into fawning. This has been mentioned here on this podcast before, and I'm going to continue to talk more about fawning because fawning for a long time in the mental health field wasn't even recognized as a protective strategy or a stress response. So fawning really goes beyond people pleasing. Okay. And it's important to know that because there's a distinction that can be made between pleasing others to stay in their good graces, right? Because you're a nice person and you just want to keep the peace and the harmony, versus fawning to protect yourself from something that feels threatening. Therapist Pete Walker introduced many of us in the trauma world to the term fawn response, which is a survival pattern where, again, a person appeases others to diffuse threat or maintain connection. But what I really love is to talk more about Ingrid Clayton. Ingrid Clayton wrote a beautiful book called Fawning. It just came out in 2025, but she takes fawning so much further. In her work, she clarifies that fawning isn't just about being helpful. Fawning is, she calls, an alignment strategy. So it's a way that the nervous system learns to minimize perceived threat by adapting self-expression, needs, and presence to match another's expectations or emotional state. So this is not polished people-pleasing or even generosity. This is, again, survival alignment. And so some of the ways that Clayton talks about fawning showing up is being overly accommodating, habitual self-suppression, excessive reassurance seeking, prioritizing the internal experience of others over your own experience. And crucially, fawning operates below conscious intention. And that's really important to understand, because a lot of times, if this is the stress response that you gravitated towards growing up in an environment where complex trauma was present, you weren't even aware that this was a survival skill. This is not a choice that you are consciously making. It is a pattern that your body learned in order to manage threat. And I'll speak from my own personal experience. In my own life, I really genuinely thought I was just simply being thoughtful. I was just a really kind person, which I still stand by that. I am thoughtful. I am kind. I am a giver, but it just looks different now with boundaries and a lot of practice. And what I later saw was that I had internalized monitoring other people's states, and not just monitoring other people's states, like scanning and reading the room, but then adjusting myself instantly. Because at one time in my life, this kept me safe. And folks, that is not laziness of self. That is bioadaptive learning. And the good news, again, there's some great news here. Adaptive patterns can be updated, not by willpower, but they can be updated through new relational experience and nervous system retraining. So again, I think I mentioned in an earlier episode, this is not the podcast for quick fixes. This has taken me years to unlearn and learn a different way. And I'm still a work in progress, but I'm a hell of a lot further along than I was. So I want to share a personal example of interrupting the fawn reflex. And this was in the last couple of years that I have really been doing this deep personal work. And this moment just really stands out to me because a friend had asked me to do something that I simply did not have the energy for. And in the past, my automatic response was, yes, sure. If it was in person, there was no pause, there was no reflection. It was just automatic, right? If it were via text, there was no lag time between the texting. It's just like, yes, I'm your go-to girl. But this particular time, because I had spent a lot of time really deconstructing a lot of the things that had kept me feeling, let's say, unwell, my body rattled and I got this familiar tightening heat in my chest. And there was this immediate urge to fix and over justify. But I paused and I said, I can't do that right now. And then came silence. And then there was this immediate disappointment that I felt, and my nervous system screamed to retract it. But I stayed, and nothing catastrophic happened. There was no rupture. There was no withdrawal of care. There was just recalibration. And my friend understood. She respected it. She also is a person who's been doing her own work too. And so it was like, cool, okay, no big deal. And that moment didn't erase the pattern wholly, but it provided new data for my system. And that data is that disappointment does not automatically equal danger. That's the work. That is capacity building. And there's a practical tool that we can use to interrupt automatic alignment. This is the tool that you might be familiar with. I learned it way back when and then kind of forgot about it, quite honestly. But then in my Truths with Food work that I've been doing, my coach, Ali Shapiro, she reintroduced this tool in a fresh new way. And she talks about it as the zoom out tool. So here's how it works. The zoom out tool is really about expanding choice. So when you're in a moment and you're experiencing a fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, we automatically go into this adaptation that is our survival self. right? And sometimes we'll say yes to something. Sometimes we'll just feel really anxious and we'll, binge eat something that we weren't hungry for, or we'll restrict and control. I'm thinking of like recent examples of, things that we've talked about in our group, but nevertheless, it can happen with this fear of disappointing others. And when you notice that familiar reflex, so that surge to explain, apologize, or over accommodate, simply pause, okay? And again, we're going to fail at this a lot, and then we're going to get this right a lot. The pausing can be the hardest part when you're first doing this work, but the more you do it, the better you get at identifying the internal story. And the internal story could sound something like, oh, I need to fix this now, or if I don't do what they're asking of me, or if I don't respond in a way that they will like, then they're going to withdraw. Or, oh my gosh, I've really messed this up now. So that is the internal story that really gets encoded with this survival self, which comes from traumatic experiences in our formative years, right? So if you can pause and you can identify the internal story, then you can ask, what else could be true? And this isn't to dismiss care, but it is to widen perspective. So they can feel disappointed and still respect me. Or if that's not necessarily true, then maybe it's I can hold my boundary and remain a kind, compassionate person. Or this moment does not define the connection with this person. And let's not mistake this reframe for cognitive bypassing. Okay. You're not just telling yourself something just to make yourself feel a little bit better in the moment. This is real nervous system retraining. And developmental psychologist Ann Maston, she highlights that resilience develops through manageable stress exposure and not avoidance. And this is really important to understand because avoid is one of our responses to high stress situations. We either move into like avoid or accommodate, or we start getting really competitive with ourselves or other people. This is not that, right? We are showing up for something in manageable ways, small ways, and exposing ourselves to the discomfort, but we are letting ourselves get curious about the story and what else could be true about the story. So this is like black belt level nervous system retraining here. And when you allow somebody to experience mild disappointment and you stay regulated, you are literally expanding your capacity. And that is not elimination of fear. It is expanded choice. And that is what we call integration. And so I want to move into some micro regulation practices. And notice I'm calling them micro because these are real-time exercises that you can practice that are very manageable. They're very small, but done consistently over and over, you get a lot of gains for it. And so if you are a person that maybe feels the rush to fix things, some examples of micro regulation practices are number one, pause. Pause, pause, pause. There is such power in pausing. If you can stay in your body, ask yourself, what feeling is coming up for me right now? Is it fear? Is it dread? Is it frustration? Is it urgency? And if you can name it, we can tame it, right? Notice after you identify the feeling or feelings, what in this moment would steady me rather than speed me up. Because we know that anxiety increases the amount of adrenaline in our body and cortisol, the stress hormone, which sends us into reactivity. But if you can notice and ask what would steady me rather than speed me up, then you can respond. So what would responding instead of reacting look like? And if you're avoiding the situation, so if they text something to you and you're like, you freeze and you're like, oh, I just don't want to answer them. I'm not going to think about it. I'm going to put my phone in another room. I'm going to do something else. Ask yourself, what if there is no wrong choice here? If I measure momentum versus perfection, what's one small step? Because we're not trying to perfect the response, because that just puts us back into our pleasing mode, right? But what would measuring momentum feel like? And what's one small step I could take? And practice sitting with about 10 to maybe 20 seconds of discomfort without immediate intervention. And in the beginning, 10 to 20 seconds, just going to be real with you, is going to feel like a lifetime. But the more you can do this, you will grow in your capacity to tolerate this discomfort. And here's a bonus micro practice for you. The next time someone expresses mild disappointment with you, so if that's a sigh or a look or maybe the tone of a text, take one slow breath. Notice your body's reaction and think to yourself, they can be disappointed and I can remain regulated. And then, and only then when you're ready, respond calmly. Even if your body still wants to retract or over explain, less words are more powerful. So each of these small moments trains your system that discomfort is not catastrophe. So I want to move into redefining disappointment and boundaries, because I know what a lot of you are probably thinking, like, yes, this sounds really well and good and lovely. And also, I might be in these types of relationships where people are used to expecting me to quickly jump in and be the yes girl and not even check with myself. And if I try to set a boundary or I try to start showing up differently, then the relationship is going to be severed and it might end and they might be upset with me. And then what is all this work for? And that is such a valid concern. And to that, I have a couple of different thoughts on. If the relationship cannot withstand boundaries and holding disappointment, then there probably honestly needed to be some reevaluating of the relationship in the beginning, right? Like, it sounds like sometimes these relationships were maybe built on sand versus a solid ground. And so that can be really hard because that can come with a lot of grief and disappointment, right? But I want us to really shift the lens on disappointment. And couples therapist John Gottman, he found that strong relationships are relationships that are not free of conflict, but rather they are marked by repair. So if the relationship is meant to last, if it is mature on both sides, if it is going to stand the test of time, there is going to be ruptures along the way. And that is just the nature of being in connection with other people that are different from you, right? But it's not so much about the rupture. It's about lasting repair, real repair. And disappointment does not signal disconnection. Rather, disappointment signals difference. If the relationship is healthy, then that means that you can hold your boundary. You can hold discomfort. You can stay regulated. And you can remain connected. These are not contradictory states. These are developmental markers of emotional maturity. So if there's something else going on where, there's been disappointment, there's been rupture, and you're not able to say, I can hold my boundaries, this person can hold their boundaries with me, we can both hold discomfort mutually, we can both stay regulated, and we can both mutually stay connected, then great, wonderful, right? Emotional maturity in a relationship, we understand that we are going to ebb and flow and that people are going to mature at different rates, but that we can still stay connected. Okay. So for me, just another personal share, I had to tell a family member that I could not meet a request. And because there is some history with this specific family member, my body's survival reflex really expected catastrophe, even after all the work that I've done around this. And when I had to deliver this information, it was like my body knew right where to go again. I was bracing. I could feel the heat again in my chest. I ruminated about it a little bit, but this time, what was different, because I've been doing a lot of work, is I stayed in my boundary. And I could tell, although this family member did not express it, I could tell they were disappointed. And that made me, again, feel really uncomfortable. But guess what? Nothing collapsed. And that moment did not instantly rewrite everything. But what it did was it expanded my nervous system's trust bank. Capacity grows through incremental experiences like this. I wanted to invite you to maybe create some space for some reflective questions. Okay. When you notice appeasing impulse surface, I would love for you to ask yourself, what am I trying to prevent here? Am I trying to prevent conflict? Am I trying to prevent my own discomfort? What is it? And secondly, what would make this more steady than urgent? So in this moment, my body might be feeling the urgency to go back to an old pattern. What would make it more steady? Is there a grounding practice? Is there a friend that I can call that really understands this? Can I talk to my therapist? Do I need to get out in nature? And then the third question, when you notice that appeasing impulse surface, how can I show up without erasing myself? So in other words, how do I stay in my values and not abandon myself? When you notice avoidance, okay, here's some other questions for you to reflect or journal on. And number one, what if this decision does not define my worth? So if I have to tell this person no, this does not define my worth, right? But maybe an old way of thinking is like, oh my gosh, like now I'm not a good friend or a good family member. Like, what if it doesn't define your worth? And number two, if I measure progress over perfection, what's one small step I can take? And finally, what story is my nervous system telling? And what else is possible? So if my nervous system feels heightened and I just like want to shrink and hide, what's the story there? And how can I revise that story? So I encourage you guys to maybe write one insight or one small action, one reassurance that you can give yourself with this exercise. Again, this is a micro practice. So as we wrap today, I just want to review the 3 key takeaways. And number 1 is that the fear of disappointing others is often tied to early relational patterning, not a character deficiency. Number 2, the fawn or appeasement response, it's an alignment strategy that can consciously be reshaped with new nervous system experience. And number 3, healing is visible through expanding our choices, pausing, tolerating discomfort, and intentional response, not elimination of fear. Each one of these regulated moments is nervous system growth. So we want to notice this and we want to celebrate this. And before we end today, I want to speak to the part of you that still braces. The part of you that watches tone, the part that replays words at night, the part that adjusted yourself to stay safe. That part of you is so skilled. It is so loyal and it is so protective. But you are allowed to update how you move through relationships. You are allowed to disappoint someone and remain a whole person. You are allowed to hold your boundary and remain kind. And you are allowed to tolerate discomfort and remain anchored. Growth doesn't mean that the fear goes away. Growth means that you respond from a place of choice. And that choice, exercised in small moments, shapes a new internal narrative. You are not just surviving. You are becoming regulated, grounded, and more of yourself. And that looks truly beautiful. I look forward to being with you again this Wednesday for a midweek reframe. It is an extension of today's episode. Until then, wishing everybody a beautiful day, and thank you for joining me. Take care. Thank you for spending this time with me today. I hope you leave feeling a little lighter, a little more grounded, and a little closer to trusting yourself and your inner experience. If this episode resonated with you, please follow or subscribe so future conversations can meet you when they're needed. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, consider sharing this episode with them. That's one of the ways this work reaches the people who need it the most. You can find me on Instagram at Cindy Payne Rooted, and you can also visit me at cindypayne.com, where you'll find all episode links, blog posts, practice updates, and a free people-pleasing style quiz designed to help you notice your patterns with more compassion. And remember, every small step towards healing, self-trust, and presence matters. You are worthy of this journey. Thanks, everyone.